Thank you, Yaz, and thanks all for joining us. And one of our goals with the town halls is to sort of take a deep dive into what's the latest and greatest issue that seems to be driving the national conversation on issues related to championing liberty against the radical Islamist tyranny that we are focused on as a Clarity Coalition. And one of the things that Sam Westrop from Middle East Forum, and I'll let him add any other identifiers that he's currently doing as far as projects at Middle East Forum, but he gave us a good introduction on some of the less known interactions between conservatives and Islamists that are problematic. This is something near and dear to my heart. In Phoenix, 20 years ago, I was trying to get conservatives not to work with Islamists on school choice issues regarding some of the two private, what I perceive as separatist Islamic schools. And over the last year, this has sort of gone into overdrive. And what we want to do is do part two of this conversation that we began in Austria. You can put some thoughts that you have in the chat as Sam begins his discussion. What we want to do is spend 30 minutes on this. We'll do 10-15 minutes of introduction, sort of getting us up to speed on where we are in July 2023. There's been a lot of action in this area. And then I'll navigate a little bit of a conversation with Sam on some issues that I think we should look for. What do we do to educate them? Because the areas where they work together with Islamists are obviously different than the progressivists, but the areas that are problematic are the same, whether you're left or right, as far as the threat of Islamists. So without further ado, Sam, if you want to get us up to speed on the growing alliance with conservatives and Islamists.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to share my screen just so this will stop other screen sharing. Is that all right? Yeah, okay, yeah. Sorry, 1 second. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint. PowerPoint is the work of Shaitan, but I will just click on a few links to illustrate a couple of points as I speak. So a few hours ago, this morning, the Council on American Islamic Relations held a rally in Montgomery County just a few hours ago. We're just watching it before hopping on this Zoom call. There, they partnered with a number of organizations and activists, including the right-leaning Moms for Liberty, to protest the, as they call it, the imposition of LGBT education in Montgomery County public schools. Here we have Islamists and the right working hand in hand on an issue that much of the right and much of the mainstream feels is a serious problem. This is an unusual situation for a group like the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR as it's better known. CAIR, at the same time as doing this, is still pushing left-leaning issues as well. It's trying to take down Confederate monuments in various southern states. It's talking about prison reform, about reparations, about various social progressivist issues at the same time. It is trying to balance a huge shift taking place, not just within American Islam, but also within American politics more generally, as it relates to the perception of and political stance of Muslim Americans. In Salzburg, we spoke quite a bit about some of the arguments within the Islamist worlds about this issue. The rise of people like Daniel Hakakatju, these furious purist activists who call out Ilhan Omar and call out CAIR and call out various other Islamist groups and politicians for failing to stand up for Islam, for embracing transgenderism, for embracing LGBT and this sort of thing. And Hakakatju has earned himself hundreds of thousands of followers, hundreds of thousands, as we've discussed in Salzburg, as we and others have written about. This is a growing phenomenon. And on the one hand, you have people like Daniel Hakakatju. On the other hand, you have figures on the right who are gradually embracing Islam. You have, most notably, I think, or best known, is someone like Andrew Tate, the human trafficking man-child who lives in Romania, currently waiting his court date for rape and trafficking charges, but at one point I think was the most Googled man in the world, and has millions of social media followers, and as of last year converted to Islam. And he manages to marry right-wing, somewhat misogynist views as well, with right-wing ideas and with Islamic ideas as well. And Andrew Tate has He may appear on the edges, on the extreme of right-wing politics, certainly, but he is certainly part of it, and he has his admirers within more mainstream conservatism as well. If I quickly open this Twitter link from Andrew Tate, you'll see him praising the decision to convert a major building in the centre of London into a mosque. The only alternative, he says, to Islam for the Brits are pride flags. They no longer have any innate culture or patriotism. I look forward to seeing the Islamic Republic of Great Britistan in her final form. Alhamdulillah, Britain will be fully Islamic soon. It would be almost tempting to imagine this as a parody account upon looking at it. But no, this man has millions of followers, and day after day I see video of dawah stalls, proselytization stalls in Europe especially, of young British or European men converting to Islam, and when they are asked why, they say Andrew Tate. He's having an effect. This is interesting. He's not the only one, of course. And if you look at prominent right-wing or right-leaning commentators here in the US, you have people like Owen Benjamin, big Trump supporter, pretty hard line, pretty extreme, not exactly your mainstream GOP activist, but he has a lot of followers. He openly calls for Sharia. He wants his wife to wear a burqa. He thinks he believes Sharia law is the best antidote to the sins of the West, the corruption, the decadence, the deviancy. So this is something we're seeing increasingly. And as discussed in Salzburg, it's more on the fringes of the right, and perhaps we shouldn't be so worried. But the GOP mainstream is starting to really embrace this. The conservative mainstream is starting to really embrace this, as we've seen with this Montgomery County schools protest. This wasn't the first. In Dearborn last year, there were similar protests about the books in libraries available there. And Muslims and Christians joined with the GOP to protest this. And this protest was backed by two big Islamist leaders, a Sunni Islamist called Dawood Walid, a very nasty Islamist connected to CARE, and a Shia Islamist called Hassan Qazwini, who's connected to the Iranian regime. Both backed this protest, and the GOP welcomed them. Let me show you. Let me know if you can't see these, by the way. If anyone else says that I'm going to click on these links and you can't see them, please do tell me, but I'm assuming they're there. Here's a tweet. Oh, good. Here's a tweet from Michonne Maddock, she runs the GOP in Michigan. Or actually, she runs the GOP in Michigan. I should add, she was indicted yesterday as part of this investigation into fraudulent Trump electors that was all over the news. But anyway, she runs the GOP in Michigan. She's tweeting. She asked Muslims, "How will you vote?" Republican, they said. Republican. So the GOP spots an opportunity. Muslims, meanwhile, have grown exasperated with the excesses of the left. They've turned to more hardline thinkers such as Daniel Hakakachu and these other extremist clerics. And the politics is shifting, and groups like CARE, who are snakes, see this, and they are shifting their own approach commensurately as well. And it's not that they've turned to Daniel Hakakachu and his pro-slavery, killing of homosexuals, killing of Jews rhetoric. They haven't embraced that wholeheartedly. But what someone like Hakakachu has done is he has convinced other more mainstream imams to change their rhetoric as well. He's forced imams like Omar Suleiman, a very prominent, perhaps the best known imam in America, to apologize for his past behavior, taking part in free gender mixing events or interfaith events with pagans and that kind of thing. So this is a big shift. This is a big change. And in response to things like Dearborn, the GOP has also welcomed it, and conservative commentators have also welcomed it. Dinesh D'Souza, for example, has praised it as an example, a wonderful example of Christians and Muslims standing together against the onslaught of progressivism as he sees it. But also in the Muslim world, Yasir Qadhi, a very prominent imam, perhaps one of the best known imams in the world, has praised Muslims and Christians coming together to advance, what does he say, wanting a purer and more morally upright society. He does so while sharing a tweet from a fairly prominent right-wing activist showing a protest in Dearborn. So this is an interesting shift, and we covered much of this in Salzburg. But what has happened since then is everything we said and everything we predicted has come to light and has been far more dramatic than we thought. And what's more, the left has noticed. And that's the big thing that has happened. The left has most definitely noticed. There's quite a few things to say here. Firstly, mainstream Muslims have, mainstream Islamists as well, have increasingly been speaking out about this. We've had people like, well, there's a very interesting blog called Mukashafat, a Muslim American blog that has been arguing that progressivist Islamists will struggle in the Biden era for the last 2 years, and suddenly their thinking is now in vogue, and suddenly there has been this realization that Donald Trump, as they put it, was good for business. It was good to oppose the right. It was good to oppose the right for 20 years. It was good to be with the left on anti-war vibes, on Islamophobia issues, on all these sort of things. And if that meant embracing a little liberalism along the way, then so be it. But now there's this realization that that's no longer what Muslims actually want. They don't want progressive. They don't want liberalism. They don't want to sell out Islam. But there's also a section of American Islam who are increasingly wealthy and middle class, who don't want to be advocating for wealth redistribution and for other far left policies that make no sense for their family, both socially and economically. And so mainstream leaders are now noticing this. We have people like Shadi al-Masri, a very prominent American Islamic scholar, saying the alliance with the left was a mistake. A liberal army is just as dangerous as an Israeli army, he adds, which is a curious addition. You've had 130 leading, well, almost entirely Islamist scholars. Oh, hello. Of course, my favorite Islamist website would be unavailable when I want it. That's a mad shame, but I can tell you what it says. This was a statement of 130 different Islamist imams clarifying their opposition to homosexuality, to transgenderism, and so on. Fascinating that they had to do this, but their silence and their duplicitousness on this issue over the last 20 years has been so extraordinary that they had to issue a statement clarifying that they, Islamists, who support Sharia law, were opposed to LGBT, were opposed to homosexuality, and so on. Similarly, the Muslim American Society has come out with a whole project on how Muslims can navigate Pride Month and how they can oppose it in a suitable way. We've had the council in Hamtramck, a Muslim-run council in Michigan, ban LGBT flags. We've had other imams like Mustafa Umar also come out and say teaming up with the LGBT lobby was a mistake, even for the sake of intersectionality. So this is happening across the board. And at the same time, you've also had Shia Islamists arguing the same thing. I saw a video just last week of a prominent Iranian regime activist in London praising Tommy Robinson, of all people, the rather far-right British anti-Muslim activist, praising Tommy Robinson for stating that Muslims and his group should be working together in the face of this progressivism. Meanwhile, shows like The Dean Show invite prominent conservatives to campaigners against transgenderism and LGBT rights to speak at mosques, to speak on their YouTube channels and so on. It's happening across the board. The final point I'd like to make about the Muslims is that there are attempts to find a middle ground. Yasir Qadhi had an article just very recently, just last month, in this is not the article I want, just in Al Jazeera, stating that, yeah, we need to oppose the left, but let's not rush into the arms of the right. He urged caution. And he was keen to urge caution because he can see where this is going. He can see Muslims becoming too dependent on another political party in the future. In fact, he says, let me quote, the sudden friendliness of politically conservative groups and media outlets towards Muslims is indeed tempting some in the community to forge new alliances with the political right after previously flirting with the left. They are making a mistake again. So this is happening all over. Nonetheless, you have people like Moshe Ansari, a very important figure in the Islamic Circle of North America. He's a graduate of Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan, the huge Islamist movement there, and we've caught him in the past working with Kashmiri terrorists, saying horrible things about Jews, the usual. Here he is being interviewed very flatteringly in the Washington Times, a right-wing paper. This Washington Times, which by the way has published the Middle East Forum, and I'm sure some of you in the past, this same Washington Times has been taking money from Qatar in recent years to run sponsored advertisements. It's been flirting with people like Ismail Royer, a prominent American Muslim voice who advocates partnership with evangelical Christians to oppose gay marriage and other usual progressivist issues. I think you're getting the picture. I think this example is a very stunning one. The American Mind, this is published by the Claremont Institute. I believe some Clarity Coalition members are graduates of the Claremont Institute's program. Meet your new allies. In this piece, he praises the Taliban as a conservative force that stands as a bulwark against globalism in a major conservative publication published by an institute that trains the next generation of conservative activists. This is happening all over. Then you had Fox News interviews with some Islamists just the other day. I'm not going to click. I've got a million more links that I'm not going to click on here because the number of examples, I'm afraid, are just too many to count. What I will finish with is the left-wing response. As I said, the left is noticing. We've had the Detroit Metro Times warning that the GOP there is indoctrinating Muslims when this loads, courting them over the ban on books. This was back in November, but since then it's become more interesting. MSNBC, someone called Jen Psaki, I'm sorry, I do not watch American cable news, so I have no idea who that is, but apparently she's important, claiming the GOP is manipulating Muslims to join in the fight against transgenderism. That made quite a bit of attention. The most extraordinary one for me, though, was this in the New York Times, one of 3 articles they published on the growing alliance between conservatives, between the GOP and Muslims. Of course, they're not saying Islamists because they're still the New York Times. They refuse to recognize Islamism. But they noticed the Muslim right-wing collaboration. This is the New York Times, and they invited a progressivist Islamist, Wajahat Ali, to come. Oh, sorry, Islamist perhaps an unfair term for him, but they invited anyway a progressivist Muslim voice to come and express these thoughts as well, to warn against right-wing forces within American Islam working with the GOP and so on. And finally, just a few days ago, Canada's Trudeau blaming the American right wing for growing protests in Canada over LGBT stuff in the schools. Now, is this all about LGBT? It does seem so for the moment. But let us not kid ourselves. This will expand to other issues as well. And we're already seeing hints of that. This is a broader question. This is a broader realization that the perceived conservatism of Islam is not a threat to American conservative values, to Western conservative values. It is a possible means to impose them. It is a tool. And that is what an increasing number of conservatives are thinking. From Trumpian circles to more respectable conservative circles, this is a thought. The very last thing I'll say before, Judy, I turn back to you, and I'm sorry, I've gone a little over time that I meant, is that isn't it fascinating how un-Islamic all of this is? All of these clerics speaking about this, they're not issuing fatwa, they're not issuing rulings, they're not citing ayat, they're not citing Quranic verse. They're talking in Western political terms. They're using the same left and right divisions that the rest of America is using. This is a very un-Islamic Islamism or Islamist issue. This is a complete shift away from the theological divisions of the past that divided American Muslims, divided Western Muslims, divided Islamism, and a move towards the more innate tribalism of politics in the West. That's interesting, and I'm not sure what the long-term effect will be on Islamic and Islamist dogma as a result of that, but that's something to watch, certainly. Sue, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I wanted to drill down on a couple things quickly. First of all, when we talk about the left, the red-green axis on the left, we've always said as much as anti-Semitism and a lot of the radicalism that we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera, might be a plurality, our hearts were that it's not a majority of the left, that if they understood what the Islamists were, that their pro-Israel nature, that a lot of the sort of centrist left would wake up to this problem. So I want to make sure on the right, as a lifetime conservative myself, I hesitate. It's easy sometimes for the left to say, well, the right has theocrats in it and a lot of other folks that have synergy with these people, so therefore they're going to be at home with them. And I'll tell you, one of the things I see here, and this is, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that while they may supposedly share some family values, the homophobia, the anti-Americanism, the deep hate that they have for, if you look at that navigating differences, for example, statement, it's far to the right, really, of many, and again, not all, but most conservative mindsets when it comes to family values issues. Am I trying to dance on the head of a pin, or is there a reality there to that part of the conversation?
Well, of course, and just as there was fundamental contradictions when it came to the left-wing Islamist alliance, there will be, and there are, contradictions when it comes to a right-wing Islamist alliance. What concerned us so much of the left, and what continues to concern us, was the extent to which the left was willing to look the other way, was willing to overlook their partners, say, kill the gays even, kill the Jews, oppress women. They were willing to overlook these things because there was a greater good in their eyes, which was the intersectional agenda, which was working with minorities to push a good, decent left-wing agenda as they saw it. Suddenly, kill the gays becomes more important to the left when that benefits the right-wing agenda, as it is now. And we're starting to see, I've seen a couple of times now in the last month, instances of left-wing activists highlight anti-gay rhetoric from Islamists who are working with the right. So something we begged them to do for 20 years, they're now doing when it suddenly risks advancing a conservative agenda. So yeah, there's obvious contradictions, and there's now who actually works to address those contradictions is entirely based on political utility. Of course, Islamism and true conservatism are not actually the same thing. But I am now deeply alarmed by the number of conservatives who are willing to look the other way, just as the left once did, about the actual views of their new partners. And that might be, that might be folks, I mean, for instance, Trump in the last few years has endorsed candidates that have, well, for example, Trump's endorsement of Oz, of what's his name? I'm sorry, the Turkish TV star.
Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz.
Yeah, Dr. Oz. One of the ways that Trump endorsed him was by pointing to the Islamophobia of his primary opponent, another Republican candidate. He said that his opponent has said some pretty unpleasant things about Muslims. Trump, the man who promised to deal with radical Islam in America. So there has been this extraordinary shift, starting with Trump, but extending to more mainstream GOP figures who are willing to work with Turkish regime proxies or align with vicious anti-American, anti-Jewish, anti-gay activists. It's happening across the board. I'm not hopeful that the right will stand up to this. I think they'll go the exact way the left did and fail to stand up for what is right.
But you do see that there's a home right of center for Muslims that embrace family values, priorities, but are clearly not homophobic and not anti free speech and other aspects to this, where they're pro parental rights. And you see where a Clarity Coalition could not alienate, for example, family values Muslims that reject the Islamist homophobia and the intolerance that exists, not only in Islamists, but in the right, but it's not the only aspect of right of center cultural politics.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I never got around to that part of the question. Yeah, no, absolutely. But of course, the one thing that a counter-Islamist coalition should be doing is not taking a position on any of these social issues. But and so not using LGBT to attack homophobia, but despairing and condemning extremist rhetoric, regardless of our thoughts on the social or political issue. And so as a result, yes, of course, there is a space for Muslims in the right.
One more issue, and then we'll open it up for questions. What was the tipping point? I mean, there were demonstrations where you had the Ilhan Omars of the world walking in gay parades years ago, and nobody seemed to bat an eye about it. And now things have shifted, almost as if there's not a realignment, but a splitting and then an alignment among divisions that's happening. It might just simply be the social milieu in America today that drove this. But if you listen to the speech that the city council guy in Seattle gave, it was just like something out of Iran, that I just could never have seen a CARE person giving that kind of a speech 5 years ago. What shifted?
It was, well, I want to say Trump. I'm not saying Trump was the shift. It occurred during Trump, though. And actually, one of the best ways to measure this is the sudden change in Muslim voting patterns, documented quite helpfully by the Islamists themselves. And you suddenly saw not a collapse in American Muslim support for the right, but a change, a shift. The graph began to go up. You saw the Islamists, progressivists, led by groups such as CARE, do so much to embrace progressivism that American Muslims finally had to notice that their own self-proclaimed leaders, with roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, no less, were actively endorsing transgenderism, abortion, little things. I mean, for example, there was a bit of a fuss 2 years into the Trump administration's term when it emerged that CARE and a bunch of other Islamist groups were using zakat monies to pay for lawsuits to sue the federal government over their immigration policies. And a lot of imams were giving khutbahs in their mosque, giving sermons saying, this is not what zakat is for. This is we do not raise money to sue the government to advance left-wing political agendas. Zakat is for charity. Zakat is to help those in need, especially Muslims in need. And there was division. Suddenly you had, of course, at the same time, the decline in the big foreign Islamist movements, such as the Brotherhood, and the growth of more Salafi and Deobandi, more clerical Islam. And clerical Islam is a lot less willing to play the political game. They've become somewhat willing to do it, as groups like the Muslim Brotherhood have descended and somewhat faded into obscurity. But by and large, they're less willing to make these sacrifices, these compromises, because they're the clerics, they're not the political activists. So it was around that Trump time that things began to change. And since Biden took office, it has sped up, mostly because these progressivist Islamists have not known what to do. And as I said at the beginning, groups like CARE are trying to do both. They're trying to be both conservative and progressivist at the same time, and it's not working for them. Meanwhile, people like Daniel Hakakachu continue to amass followers, amass supporters, and he's amassing clerical allies in the Deobandi community and Salafi communities. He ambushed Suhaib Webb, a very prominent imam in Houston last week. That video was viewed millions of times by Muslims around the world, because here was Daniel Hakakachu, one imam, condemning one preacher, condemning an imam, a very famous imam, Suhaib Webb, for not standing up to progressivism.
All right, well, thank you. This was just unbelievably helpful, and we will have it saved for posterity to educate folks that weren't able to be here. So thanks again, and I'll turn it back over to Yaz.